If you work anywhere close to industrial automation, manufacturing, and those kind of domains, you know there is a mismatch between IT and OT. That's not news. And for us IoT practitioner, it's a little bit of a frustration considering IoT could be that missing link to connect these two worlds. David is joining me on the IoT show to discuss this topic and to see, what could help resolve this clash of the clans. So David and his friend Willem created the IT/OT Insider blog and podcast, and more recently the Academy. They have a lot to teach us about how to put together the two families that IT and OT are and resolve that clash of the clan situation. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel, give us a like, it really helps us, as well as comments. And don't forget to share this with your friends. Hey everyone, this is the IoT Show. I'm Olivier, your host. Today with David, we'll talk about the IT/OT clash of the clans, right? Hey David, how are you?
Good at yourself.
I'm great and fantastic. So David, for our audience here, can you tell us about yourself? Who are you? Where are you coming from? And what are you doing these days?
Yeah, I'm a mathematical engineer by training. About 15 years ago, started working in the chemical industry. Learned everything there is to learn about data, about cybersecurity, about, well, basically building digital solutions in the chemical industry. And then 3 years ago, I switched, I always say, to the dark side. So I switched from end user to vendor. Currently managing a data ops solution provider, and in those conversations I'm having with my customers, prospects, I found myself always sitting somewhere in the middle of that clash. I actually didn't I didn't use the word clash before this, but I like your phrasing. I found myself a bit sitting in this clash between IT and OT, and I also found that we are lacking some concepts, some common language, ways to start collaborating, and that's why 2 years ago I founded the IT/OT Insider. Started as a blog and a podcast just to share experience, share the things we come across, and that's me and my co-founder Willem. And then also now, very shortly, or just a few weeks ago, we also introduced our IT/OT Academy.
We'll talk about this academy in a minute. And I did mention Clash of the Clans because, same as you, when I'm in these conversations where there is an OT team and an IT team, my job as an IoT practitioner is to implement solutions that probably are that missing link between these two different teams, right? We're trying to tie the data from the OT world into the business world, extract insight, analytics, and re-inject control command, after evaluating the efficiency of the equipment, working on predictive maintenance and this kind of things. And so that's something that I realized this is really a clash. This is something where the I would say the conversations are getting hidden like hot very fast, and there's like
Yes.
finger pointing and so on. I mean, that's my outsider perspective. That's what I'm saying, and that's why for me it's really that clash. You guys are the same family. Why are you fighting? And so could IoT be that missing link? Let's try and figure that out today. There is a mismatch. So I, proposed my perspective. You're coming from this world as well, and you decided to go on to creating that podcast, creating the academy to educate people on that mismatch, on this, siloed situation between the two worlds. Tell me a bit more about that.
It starts with a different language. We are really speaking a different language between IT and OT. We are talking about IT is talking about pipelines, OT is talking about pipelines. Totally different thing. IT is talking about containers, OT is talking about containers. Totally different thing. The the IT variant and the physical one. So we're talking a different language. And a while ago, and this was actually the birth of the blog. A while ago, I was in such a meeting where it was a full day workshop, and it actually took us a couple of hours in the discussion until somebody said like, are we actually meaning the same thing? So we went to a whiteboard, started drawing some concepts, and came to the conclusion that the first few hours of this workshop, we were saying the same words, but had a totally different meaning. That actually was a bird of the of the block where we wanted to start working on creating this common language, or at least explaining each other's language. So that was actually the first step.
No, that's a good anecdote because I can share lots of frustration I'm having as well in these conversations where the two teams cannot really align. They have the same objectives. They want to work together. They have
Yeah.
to, but they don't understand each other, and that reinforces my analogy with Clash of the Clans. Right, there are two clans using the same words but not
Hmm.
with the same meaning. So they are
Yeah.
lacking that understanding between each other, and it leads into failure of IoT projects
Yeah.
because of
Absolutely.
that. Right.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, where we, I would say, started with language or common language, or I would say even different language, the next problem is a problem of inherent silos. IT and OT have different reporting lines. IT will always report up to some kind of a CIO, IT director, IT manager, or whatever his or her title is. OT will almost always report into the operations organization. Now, because you have these different reporting lines, first of all, you don't have shared targets. That's number one. Secondly, you typically don't have shared budgets. And even worse, you don't even have the same ways to budget your things. For example, OPEX versus CAPEX, where IT is really living in this subscription world, and OT, you just want to make your planning for the next 10 years, because when you're building an asset, you want to decide what are we going to put in that asset. And maybe we can touch a bit upon about that, I would say, those typical components later in the interview. But you want to decide what to put in the asset, um, and then you run with that for 10, 15, 20 years. So it's a totally different mindset as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you say, and would you say it applies to both bigger and smaller players of the industry? Because when we talk about, big companies, it's kind of almost obvious and common to have different budgets, different objectives, and so on, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
does the same thing apply to smaller company in manufacturing and other industrial domains?
Yeah. Yeah, it does to some extent. There is a big difference in the verticals. For example, in the process industry, pharma, critical infrastructure, you have a totally different starting point compared to, um, for example, bakeries, discrete manufacturing. So you do see a quite of a big split in the, I would say, in the verticals. But in general, you will always have these silos to some extent.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I realized recently, I think it was during our conversation on your podcast, and Ryan, myself representing Thing Zero, and Willem and you were really geeking out on IoT and talking about IoT in the context of ITOT.
Hmm.
And something that came to me is which is like really realizing, or it became clear to me that IoT can be that missing link between these two worlds of OT and
Hmm.
IT, not just by the word, right? Because there is both IT and OT in IoT, but also by the fact that today OT perceives IoT as an IT thing, and
Hmm.
IT perceives IoT as an OT thing. What
Hmm.
I just said is full of acronym and super hard to understand. But basically, IoT is in the middle and is perceived as the thing from the other side. And as myself as an IoT practitioner, I'm trying to think about what are the elements of an IoT solution, because IoT is a bunch of set of technologies and
Hmm.
features and components. What are the things that we can try and bring these two worlds together around, right? What are the main, concepts of
Yeah.
technologies that you believe could be the ones that will make these two clans top their clash, basically?
It's, I would say, what the most important thing I see changing right now is the way we deal with data. Now, and bear with me for a few minutes because if we look to the traditional OT world, you would have your, I would say, your traditional sensors, your traditional wiring. You would have a SCADA or DCS system, depending on the vertical you're in. And there is a very good reason to have a stable or a stable SCADA system or a stable DCS system, because it's typically very important for safety, reliability, that type of things. You want those wires. Um, on the other hand, a couple of years ago, we saw first IoT projects popping up, where it was more seen as a nice to have kind of thing. Now, at that point, because there was not really a good link between the OT and the IT world, these IoT projects, they almost by default lived in the IT world, but that gave basically rise to two separate sets of data. Now, what we're seeing changing right now is this need to get standardized around a data layer which is not just an OT anymore. It's also not really an IT thing anymore. It sits somewhere in the middle, because you want to feed that data layer with your, if we talk about the Purdue model, so the classical model, you want to feed that data from the lower levels, from your level 2, level 3. You want to feed that into the data platform. You want to augment that with as much as you can. So with contextual data, for example, what am I producing, with planning data, with maintenance data, but also more and more and more with IoT data. And for example, take the water world. I really like the distribution of drinking water, for example, here. What you see here is that it's critical infrastructure. They have their SCADA systems already for a very, very long time, spread across cities, regions, in some cases even countries. So that means that you have a SCADA system which can literally span a country, and you need that. But now you see these smart meters coming up, which means that typically, well, at least I don't know what's the case where you're living, Olivier, but for example, here where I'm living in Belgium, I now have a smart water meter in my home. Now, this becomes really, really interesting, because where a typical water company might be controlling a couple of thousand, maybe a couple of 10,000 IO, all of a sudden they get hundreds of thousands, in some cases even millions of IoT meters, which you now have to combine. Now, if they do that in a very smart way and they combine it in a single data platform, then it gives them additional possibilities, for example, for leak detection. Because imagine this, if you know how much water is flowing through your main pipes, where you have your traditional metering, but you also know from all your consumers how much water is being consumed at every single consumption point, then you can actually build a digital twin where you can perfectly detect at what well, maybe not to the meter, but at least to the street or to the block where you have leaks in your pipes. It is possible, but it's still, I would say, we're taking steps into this direction. But this is again an example where I say, like, it's data, is the need for data platforms which tied it all together.
But what says data says that there's collection. That's part number one. Then you
Mm-hmm.
need to unify or harmonize the data as a
Mm-hmm.
normalization is to happen. And then you would be able to eventually combine the data by establishing these models and then establishing the relationship,
Yeah.
hence the twins you just mentioned, right? Because you need to structure the data somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can implement analytics, right? It could
Yeah.
be simple
Yeah.
rules, but then you can implement things super smart with AI. So here we go. We have the AI keyword in the conversation. So we'll score high in
Check.
SEO here, but check. But bottom line, AI cannot do anything with
No.
random, not normalized data, right? So it's one thing to
Yeah.
collect a lot of data. So data ops definitely super important, because you need to stream the data, you need to enrich it on a way, contextualize it, as
Mm-hmm.
you were saying,
Mm-hmm.
for it to be analyzable, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But in between, that means that you need to start thinking about different types of infrastructure. It's not everything on site or everything in the cloud. Not
Yeah.
everything on site, because you don't have enough storage or compute to deal with that much data. And data is coming from different sites, anyways. But you can't either have everything happening on the other end of the story, which is in the cloud. So you need to start thinking about hybrid infrastructure, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is actually really interesting, because when we just go back a couple of years ago, if you want to, if you wanted to, I would say, solve the OT data problem, you would always go to a traditional OT software vendor, because dealing with time series data, especially at scale, was something you would, yeah, you would buy it from an OT vendor. There was not really a question about that. What I've been seeing is that you see a lot of changes in the on the IT side to also handle vast amounts of time series data. There is a catch though, and the catch is that storing time series, as you said, storing time series data at scale, not a big deal anymore.
Mhm.
But contextualizing that time series data, that's something where I still believe that today we have steps to take. This isn't really a problem which is solved, and you know what, let's just buy this or this solution, or let's just tie in or tie together a component A and B and we're
Mhm.
solved. This contextualization thing, that's still kind of a gray zone. And making it even more complex is once you start duplicating data, because yeah, at a certain point in time, you might have something living in a cloud, you might have something living on the edge. You want to tie that together. Where are we going to do it? Are we going to duplicate data? How are we going to write back? For example, for these IoT sensors, you might also want to write back data to your SCADA system, etc. And this is still, hey, we're now 2025. Steps have been taken, but it's still a gray zone. So I do expect
Yeah.
lots of changes, lots of new tech coming in the years to come to really make that more easy, I would say.
I would argue the fact that I think technology exists to implement, a
Hmm.
smart way of contextualizing data at different levels or in different places. Technology exists. Now you're able to deploy some node of compute and storage on your edge, whether it's a virtual edge in local data center or it's your actual factory floor with a
Hmm.
rack of servers down there, or maybe a gateway, something a bit smaller. But one thing has been obvious to me, in the past few years, is that there's no two factory floors, there's no two customers the same.
No, no.
Like I'm working these days on an asset monitoring project with a big customer in manufacturing. Even across the different plants, different sites, they're not using the same SCADA systems,
No.
they're not using the same EMSs. They all have their own way of doing things. And so data from the assets come from different sources in different
Yeah.
formats. And it's something where you need to think, okay, so should I get all that data? Where do I unify the data? Where do I normalize it? Should I do that in a data center that collects data from
Hmm.
X plants and then send it up to a cloud? Should I do everything in the cloud? And really, that's a conversation we're having. How
Yeah.
customized should that infrastructure be? And it's there, the implementation of that hybrid custom infrastructure is hard because for
Yeah.
IT, it's a new domain, and for OT, it's a new domain as well. OT starts to see, hey, we need to have in our infrastructure, in our networks, machines that are
Yeah.
managed by IT. And IT is like, well, wait a second, I'm going to have this box that is down there. How do I manage the workloads on them? It's not a virtual machine where I can deploy a microservice. It's now a Kubernetes cluster. It's now a Docker engine. And so you're just like in that blurry or foggy area where it's hard for both sides, but it's necessary, right? Because of what we just mentioned for data ops to happen.
It definitely is it definitely is necessary. And even if you would be running the same software, you would be running on totally different versions probably, or have totally different implementations. And the
Yeah,
things, it's
just
also
to have some
it's
fun.
also how industry works, because manufacturing, that's a merger and acquisition industry. You can now work for a couple of years to standardize a couple of plans, a couple of lines, and then tomorrow your management decides to acquire another company, and you're back to square one. So it is a bit how we work. So to come back to this point, one of the concepts we talk about on the blog and in the podcast is this. First of all, we talk about how a data platform should look like from a more conceptual point of view. I'm not going to maybe not going into the details here in this talk. I think what is more important is we also have one of our other articles. I think it was called "Is the Platform Stupid?" And it was really so. In the article, we talked about the need for platform thinking. Now, imagine this. So. If you say the normal way we typically work is we build custom interfaces, we standardize, we don't really standardize, or we just do it very local. Um, we buy tool A, we buy tool B, but also in the cloud we see the same. I had a discussion just a couple of days ago with a company who used I would say very advanced cloud features, but the way they built their platform was custom. Now, this means that while you are growing, while you are ingesting more data or linking more systems, or whatever you're doing to grow, your teams grow, you have more data scientists. What I typically see is that your speed of development actually slows down. So instead of, maybe tomorrow we have, instead of 2 data scientists, we have 4 data scientists. So you hope that they would be able to do twice the amount of projects. But the reality is that that's typically not the case. I saw that myself as well when I was still in the chemical industry. At a certain point in time, we had a system which was so well integrated in every aspect of the company, but every integration was bespoke, which meant that once when we got a new request, this was like, "Ooh, don't don't touch this thing because it might fall apart." So what you do want is take a few steps back, start thinking more from this new modern platform approach, where you want to have this catalyzing effect. This effect where you start combining data sources, you start normalizing, you start standardizing, etc., etc. And you're not only making data access easy, you're making the context easily available to everybody in the organization. But even more important, every time somebody builds a KPI or a machine learning model, you also want to feed back those learnings in the model. So the next time somebody wants to do something clever, well, basically half the work was already done. So you get this catalyzing effect, which makes it easier and easier for you to do this data project. Now, the way you do that, and now we come back to the cloud thing, is the way you do that is to not customize too much. And this is an interesting balance where should we really go for a self-built approach? Should we start combining several products together? Or do we more go for a standardized software approach from one or several vendors? But we can basically piggyback on their innovation as well, which makes it hopefully less custom.
Yeah. And that adds to the complexity, that just asking yourself this question makes it even more complex and I would say daunting for companies who are trying to digitally transforming and get to
Mm-hmm.
to that point where they will be in the future, right, of things. And there's
Yeah.
another dimension, which is where they're coming from. If we
Yeah.
if we rewind a little, during Industry 3.0, there's been the first movers and fast followers. First movers have been adopting, OT at scale, and so they equipped in like
Yeah.
huge SCADA systems and so on, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ones who were late in the game, or let's say, fast followers, they didn't do that big investment. So in a way, they're less tied into that old way of doing things with the big SCADA systems and so on. But they are now at the same point, and they want to digitally transform to get to Industry
Yeah.
4.0 and all the promise of what it can bring. But they're not starting with the same mindset and from the same place, right?
Yeah, and this is really important. I have been thinking about concepts around data platforms, but in this case, for example, also collaboration models. How do you collaborate across silos, or how do you bring silos together? And the thing is, if you, for example, have these heavy industries like the water example I talked about, it makes sense that they have heavily invested in these really expensive systems. So that means that they are in a certain mindset. They're also in a certain ecosystem of tools.
Yep.
They're happy to use. Um, and those are typically really, really good tools, but they already are in a certain mindset somehow. Now they also want to become data driven. Um, the advantage for them is they typically have lots of expertise. They already made certain decisions. They already have lots of data available, albeit maybe in a legacy historian somewhere, but they typically have a lot of data available. So for them, it's really about how can we leverage all the investments we done in the past. How can we decouple those a bit from yeah the because you don't want to immediately cross the IT/OT bridge, so you want to decouple those investments a bit and then really focus on a more modern data approach to feed all that data in a modern data system and then move forward. Now these fast followers are the ones who in the past they didn't really have the need to do those heavy investments. I think a lot of manufacturers are fast followers. Those are the ones who just bought machines. For example, I've been working with a watch producer where you're making watches, but you don't really need OT to make a watch. You need craftsmanship assisted by robots. So they just bought some robots or some machines. They don't need a
Yeah.
SCADA system. But then the other example, I already mentioned an industrial bakery. Yeah, most bakeries, you buy some machines. They are equipped with PLCs, with some HMIs, and that's about it. Now, those also want to those companies also want to become data driven. They have a totally different starting point because, first of all, they typically do not have lots of expertise in house. They typically do
Mhm.
not really have an OT department in-house because there was no need. So that means that for those companies, these investments will typically be driven more by the IT side of the organization. Um, but the end game is kind of similar because they also want to get that data into a data platform, but the starting point is totally different.
Yep. So that adds this kind of generational clash to the
Hmm.
language clash that we have between our clans, right? So, David, for us to help the different, customers,
Yeah.
players, actors out there better understand how they can connect the two worlds and how they can move forward in their digital transformation. So you created, along the years, the IoT Insider
Mhm.
podcast, and now you just created the academy. So tell me a bit about the academy so that we can really invite people to go check it out because they need
Yeah.
these kind of content and learnings for them to move forward.
Yeah, it would be amazing. When you do the blog, when you do the podcast, you basically just write whatever you want to write about at that time, or you talk on whatever you want to talk about when you come across somebody. You go, this is an interesting conversation. Let's do this. It's not really structured. So the academy is basically the result of me doing workshops across the world with manufacturing companies, and they asked me, okay, David, um, if you come to our facilities, like, okay, how are we actually going to start? And for us, it's about three important things. We already mentioned the language, so it is super important for IT to talk OT and for OT to talk IT. And it's not about this is not a SCADA course or an MES course or an I don't know, whatever course, but it's really about this basic concept. So basic understanding is key. If we understand each other, we can trust each other. Very important. Second step is all our work around our cooperation models. What are our
Mhm.
cooperation models? We actually learned a lot from the DevOps movement, team topologies movement. For those who are in more on the IT side, I'm sure those names will ring a bell. Um, you can learn so much from how IT went through this dev versus ops movement, and that dev versus
Mhm.
ops thing actually also applies to IT versus OT. The only difference, or the most important difference, is again we're reporting into two different parts of the organization, where dev and ops in IT is typically reporting to one CIO, but for the rest
Yep.
we can do quite a lot of similar things. So I would say the second step is talk about cooperation models. How can we break through those silos? What steps do we take until we are really cooperating? If we are cooperating, we need to start building solutions and we need to scale them and sustain them. And that's where our work around data ops, data platforms comes in. So the academy is really structured around these three blocks. And now the funny thing is that when we started writing the blog. What I didn't really suspect at that point was the amount of technology companies and even venture capitalists and consultants who would be following our content. And it kind of makes sense because there aren't too many places where you can learn OT, right? If you're working for a
Yeah.
technology company, either you accidentally worked on the shop floor somewhere and that's where you learned OT, but if not, there aren't too many schools, too many universities where you can actually learn OT. So for those groups, it is actually more a general learning course.
Yeah. Awesome. And so we'll put some links down there. People can go there. The concept is what? They get into courses, lessons, they have online content. Is it in-person workshops? How does it work?
Yeah, so the ITOT Academy is a live online course. So that means that
Okay.
um, you are sitting in a conversation. If you would be Willem, then this would be the ITOT Academy, and people would be listening to us. We would be talking about our concept. They can ask us questions, and etc. So it's a live online course,
Okay.
6 times 2 hours. We really wanted to make it short and sweet because everybody's agenda is obviously so full. So 6 2-hour sessions, very easy to fit into your agenda. And then yeah, afterwards you obviously get the recordings and the slides and the extra material to, I would say, to take a further yeah, to deepen your knowledge even more. But that's yeah, up to the one who is following the ITOT Academy.
I love that. Thanks, David. We'll put the links down there. Let's try and bring peace between the clans and make sure IT and OT can work together and have this IoT missing link hooking them up. Yeah.
Is this where you do the little hearts?
Exactly. I love that. I love that. Well, thanks, David, again for your time today, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon.